As I was making my way out of the Belarusian Baltic railway station, Reich appeared. We loaded ourselves and the 2 suitcases into a sleigh. A thaw had set in that day. We had only been underway a few minutes, driving down the broad Tverskaya with its gleam of snow and mud, when Asya waved to us from the side of the street. Asya did not look beautiful, but wild beneath her Russian fur hat. Her face was somewhat puffy from all the time she had spent bedridden. We stopped off briefly at the hotel and then had tea in a so-called pastry shop near the sanatorium. I told her about Brecht. Asya came by late in the morning. I gave her a few things, then we went for a walk. We turned back at the Liverpool hotel. I gave her presents, blouse, stockings. We talk. I observe that she basically forgets nothing that involves us. Before she leaves, I read her the section about wrinkles in One-Way Street. During my first few days, I am above all struck by the difficulty of getting used to walking on the very icy streets. I have to watch my step carefully, so that I cannot look around very much. The situation improved when Asya bought me a pair of galoshes yesterday morning. My hair is very electric here. During the morning, I improved my sense of orientation in the city by taking a long walk along the inner boulevards to the central post office, and then back across Lubyanka Square to Dom Hertzena. I solved the mystery of the man with the alphabet board. He was selling letters which one can affix to one's galoshes in order to prevent them from being mixed up. In the afternoon at Asya's, Reich read us his preliminary review of Meyerhold's production of The Inspector General. Some Mongols stand by the Kitai-Gorod wall. The winter is probably no less harsh where they come from, and their ragged furs are no worse than those of the indigenous people. Still, one feels spontaneous pity for them due to the climate. They stand no more than 5 paces from each other and offer leather briefcases for sale. Each one's wares are identical to those of his neighbor. We stood in front of a farrier's shop where Asya had already stopped once before during our first walk along Pietrovka. A splendid fur outfit with colorful pearls was hanging on the wall. It was priced at 250 rubles. Asya wanted to have it. I told her, if I buy it, I'll have to depart right away. But she made me promise that I would, someday, give her a big present that would remain with her for the rest of her life. The luxury that has lodged itself in this ailing run-down city like tartar in a diseased mouth. The N-Kraft chocolate store, the elegant fashion boutique on Pietrovka, where immense porcelain vases stand among the furs, hideous and frigid. The street corners, particularly in those quarters where foreigners do business, are covered with bundles of reg-like beds in the great open-air sick bay called Moscow. One rarely sees anybody give. Begging has lost its most powerful base, the guilty social conscience that opens purses so much wider than pity. In the morning, St. Basil's Cathedral. In warm, cozy colours, its facade glows onto the snow. The regular ground plan generated a construction whose symmetry cannot be visually grasped from any direction. The spectator could only ambush this building from the height of an airplane, against which its builders forgot to protect themselves. I was writing my diary and had given up hope that Asya would stop by. Then she knocked. As she entered the room, I wanted to kiss her. As usual, it proved unsuccessful. We took a sleigh into town and visited a number of stores on Pietrovka in order to buy fabric for her dress. Later with Reich in Pansky's office. He showed me to the screening room where films were being shown to American journalists. Unfortunately, I arrived just as the screening of Battleship Potyomkin was coming to an end. All I saw was the final act. I went home, and shortly thereafter Reich arrived, soon followed by Asya. For a few minutes, Asya and I were alone. All I remember is that I said the words, "preferably forever," and that she laughed so hard at this that I realized she had understood. Afterwards, I finally managed to telephone Josef Roth, who lives in grand style. The long and the short of it, he had come to Russia a convinced Bolshevik and was leaving it a royalist. As usual, the country is left to foot the bill for the change in colour that occurs in the convictions of those who arrive here as scintillating reddish-pink politicians. His face is all creased with wrinkles and has the unpleasant, withered look of a snoop. After having changed money at the Goss Bank, we went to buy the fabric. On our return home, we happened on a crew shooting a film. Asya told me that this should really be described. The way people immediately lose their heads on these occasions and tag along for hours, and then get to their offices all flustered, unable to explain where they have been. You realize how true this is when you observe how many times a meeting has to be arranged here before it finally takes place. Nothing ever happens as planned or expected. This banal formulation of life's complications is borne out so implacably and so intensely in every single instance here that you quickly come to grasp the fatalism of the Russians. After a brief stop in my hotel, we drove to the vicinity of the Krasnaya Varota to see a film which Pansky had claimed would outdo the success of Battleship Potemkin. It was sold out. We went to Yelovaya's nearby apartment to have some tea. The room was just as bare as all the ones I had seen so far. On its grey wall, the large photograph showing Lenin reading Pravda. The time spent in this room with a cup of tea and a piece of bread was the best part of the evening. The film turned out to be an unbearable botch, and they projected it at such a dizzying speed. For me, Moscow is now a fortress. The harsh climate, which is wearing me down, although it is also healthy for me, my ignorance of the language, Reich's presence, Asia's utterly circumscribed mode of existence. If I am still holding out fairly well, it is also because, despite everything, I recognize Asia's attachment to me. The familiar du seems to have gained ground between us. I don't remember a woman granting such long looks and such long kisses. Today I told her that I now wanted to have a child by her. Spontaneous yet rare gestures, which are not without significance, given the control she has now imposed on herself in erotic matters, tell me she is fond of me. At one point in the past few days she said it was entirely my fault that we were not now living on a wild island and didn't have 2 children. There is some truth to this.
Уважаемые посетители, приглашаем вас на экскурсию Москвой. Уважаемые посетители, приглашаем вас на
Я не могу найти ее. Крис звонил, они говорят, берегись. 20 метров. Зачем мне 20 метров? Ну, полностью обвешивайте.
I was at the Kustarny Museum in the morning. One could see again very beautiful toys. The papier-mâché figures are perhaps the most beautiful. There are also very large figures of the same material that represent types easily verging on the grotesque and that already belong to a period of decline. Asia's room in the sanatorium. We are there virtually every day from 4 to 7. When we arrive, Asia is usually lying on the bed. Across from her, on a small table, there is milk, bread, and a plate with sugar and eggs, which Reich generally takes home with him. But today she gave him an egg for me and wrote Benjamin on it. Over her dress, Asia wears a grey woolen sanatorium smock. Asia often works on the blouse she is making for herself, pulling threads from a piece of fabric. The Christmas tree is still standing in my room. In conversations with Reich, I have been explaining how contradictory the current situation of Russia is. In its foreign policy, the government is pursuing peace in order to enter into commercial treaties with imperialist states. Domestically, however, it is above all trying to bring about a suspension of militant communism, wanting to commit itself to a long-term period free of class conflict, to depoliticize the life of its citizens as much as possible. An attempt is being made to arrest the dynamic of revolutionary progress in the life of the state. It is extremely significant that a very run-of-the-mill Russian film actor, Ilyinsky, an inept imitator of Chaplin, is considered a major comic here, simply because Chaplin's films are so expensive that one doesn't get to see them. Russian film itself, apart from a few outstanding productions, is not all that good on average. It is fighting for subject matter. Film censorship is, in fact, very strict. Above all, Russian film knows nothing of eroticism. As is well known, the trivialization of love and sex life is part and parcel of the communist creed. At noon, Reich had put me in touch with Meyerhold, who had promised me tickets. Much to my surprise, Asia arrived on time. The revue was quite interesting, and for a moment we again felt closer to each other. We spoke with Meyerhold in the intermissions. During the first intermission, as we were looking for Meyerhold, I was ahead of Asia on the stairs for a moment. Suddenly I felt her hand on my neck. My coat collar had gotten turned up, and she was folding it back into place. At this contact I realized just how long it had been since any hand had touched me gently. Asia scolded me for not having purchased anything. Otherwise, she said, she would have continued on to my place to celebrate New Year's Eve. I proposed that we go to a cafe, but to no avail. I accompanied her home, saddened and silent. The snow that night had the sparkle of stars. When we arrived in front of her house, I asked her, more out of defiance and more to test her than out of any real feeling, for one last kiss in the old year. She wouldn't give me one. I turned back. It was now almost New Year's Day, certainly alone, but not all that sad. After all, I knew that Asia too was alone. I would like to write on the flowers of Moscow, not dealing solely with the heroic Christmas roses, but also with the huge hollyhocks on the lampshades which peddlers proudly brandish throughout the city. Only here can you find constructions created out of nothing more than spun sugar, sweet icicles on which the tongue takes its revenge against the bitter cold. One might also mention what the frost inspires, the peasant shawls, whose designs, stitched in blue wool, imitate ice flowers on the window pane.
А я туда вторую.
Такой на ночь работает, и то голодный всем.
Moscow is the most silent of all metropolises, and doubly so in snow. The principal instrument in the orchestra of the streets, the automobile horn, is rarely played here. The calls of the street vendors are also very subdued. The street trade is for the most part illegal and does not want to call attention to itself. Also the vendors address the passers-by less with calls than with measured, if not whispered, words, in which there is something of the pleading tone of beggars. There is one curious thing about the streets. The Russian village plays hide and seek in them. If you pass through any of the large gateways, they often have wrought iron gratings, but I never encountered one that was locked. You find yourself at the threshold of a spacious settlement, whose layout is often so broad and so expansive that it seems as if space cost nothing in this city. State capitalism in Russia retains many of the features of the inflation era. On the one hand, the new economic policy has been authorized, but on the other, it is only tolerated in the interest of the state. From a Russian point of view, there are colossal fortunes accumulating in certain hands. I have heard of people who pay more than 3 million rubles in taxes. These citizens are the opposite to the heroism of wartime communism. Further considerations: join the party, clear advantages, a solid position, a mandate, even if only by implication, organized, guaranteed contact with other people. Against this, to be a communist in a state where the proletariat rules means completely giving up your private independence. You leave the responsibility for organizing your own life up to the party, as it were. But where the proletariat is oppressed, it means rallying to the oppressed class with all the consequences this might sooner or later entail. Asia again needs to get some injections. She was, as a result, in a somewhat agitated state, and when we were alone, she clung to my arm in a momentary surge of her former boldness. Reich had taken up his position in the room and was making no signs of leaving. So that even though Asia had finally come to my room in the morning once again, it was totally pointless. I therefore left her alone with Reich and went to the Museum of Painting. After this little episode, my mind was finally made up to fix the date of my departure, which in any case was rapidly approaching. Shortly after 8, I had already given up all hope that Asia would come. It had been a long time since I had waited for her like this. I had just started to draw a schematic image of my waiting for her when there was a knock at the door. I read her random passages from the Moscow diary. I had chanced upon the part where I dealt with communist education. "It's utter nonsense," said Asia. She was annoyed and claimed I knew nothing about Russia. She spoke of how she herself had not understood Russia in the least at the outset, how she had wanted to go back to Europe a few weeks after her arrival because everything seemed finished in Russia, and the opposition was absolutely right. Gradually she had realized what was in fact taking place here. The conversion of revolutionary effort into technological effort. Now it is made clear to every communist that at this hour, revolutionary work does not signify conflict or civil war, but rather electrification, canal construction, creation of factories. The clock is set for departure. It is getting colder and colder. The average temperature is minus 20 degrees, and it is becoming more difficult to fulfill my remaining obligations. I used the morning to look at the 3 railway stations: Kursk Station, Oktober Station, from where the trains to Leningrad leave, and Yaroslavsky Station, which is where the trains to Siberia leave. The restaurant in the railway station is crowded with palm trees and looks out onto a waiting room painted in blue. You feel as if you were at the zoo in the Antelope Pavilion. I had some tea there and thought about the departure. The most important plan of my visit to Bazeches the previous day was that I managed to convince him to help me with the formalities of my departure. I was able to persuade Bazeches to take another sleigh and accompany me to the upper shopping levels of the state store Gum, where the dolls and riders I had been eyeing were located. I asked Asia to come to my place that evening, and she promised to do so if possible. After dinner, I waited for her in vain. The constellation of circumstances had been so difficult for weeks that I was miles away from expecting such a gesture, and it took some time before it made me happy. I was like a vessel with a slender neck into which liquid was being poured from a pail. First I asked Asia for a kiss amid the usual pleas, but then it was as if an electrical switch had suddenly been flipped, and now, as I was trying to talk or read aloud to her, she kept on insisting on yet another kiss. We unearthed tenderness that had nearly been forgotten. Meanwhile, I presented her with the food I had purchased and with the dolls. She chose one of them, and it is now sitting across from her bed in the sanatorium. I also brought up the subject of my Moscow stay once again, and since Asia had actually uttered the decisive words the previous day, as we were on our way to Reichs, I needed only to repeat them. The place Moscow now occupies in my life is such that I can only experience it through you. This is true, regardless of any love affair, romantic interest, etc. We kissed a lot, but the thing that excited me the most deeply was the touch of her hands. She herself had, in fact, once told me that everybody who was attached to her felt the extremely powerful forces that emanated from her hands. A stretch of days with wonderful warm weather. Moscow is again drawing much nearer to me. I feel the desire to learn Russian, just as I did during the first days of my stay. I consider each day a gift that has been given to me 2 or 3 times over, because each is so beautiful, because Asia is now often near to me, and because each is a day I have granted myself beyond the planned duration of my stay. We proceeded to the Arbat and went into the Praga restaurant. Asia was embarrassed about having come to such a sophisticated establishment wearing torn shoes. She had put on her new dress at the seamstress's. It had been sewn together out of some old, already moth-eaten black fabric, but it looked very good on her, and on the whole resembled her blue one. Asia ordered a shashlik, and I had a glass of beer. Asia told me that there had been a time when she would have very much wanted to marry me, and if things had not turned out that way, she thought it was I and not she who had gambled away the opportunity. I said, if she had wanted to marry me, then her demons had certainly played a role in this wish. Yes, she had thought about how unbelievably comical it would have been to introduce herself as my wife to my acquaintances. But there was no more future in store for us now. I got on the next streetcar and took it to the last stop, riding for about half an hour in a more or less straight path through that part of town that lies on the far side of the Moskwa. The fact is that any excursion I might have taken with Asia, no matter where it might have led, would have been far less enjoyable. I was too tired for it. But now I was feeling happy with this forced, nearly pointless trip through a part of the city with which I was completely unfamiliar. I also saw the enormous Moscow radio transmitter, whose shape is different from any other I have seen. I once again went to my pastry shop that morning, ordered coffee and ate a sweet roll. It was only when I got back to my room that I noticed a note from Asia on the desk. I rushed down to the street and saw her coming in my direction. She had only had a piece of meat to eat and was still hungry, and before taking her back to my room, I ran out into the square and bought her some tangerines and snacks. Now she was lying on the bed in my room. I sat by her side, where I wrote my address on envelopes for her, then went to my suitcase and unpacked the toys I had purchased during the past few days and showed them to her. She took a great deal of pleasure in this, but in the meantime I was fighting back tears. I asked Asia to hail a sleigh. As I was about to get in, having said goodbye to her one more time, I invited her to ride to the corner of Tverskaya with me. I dropped her off there, and as the sleigh was already pulling away, I once again pulled her hand to my lips, right in the middle of the street. She stood there a long time, waving. I waved back from the sleigh. Holding my large suitcase on my knees, I rode through the twilit streets to the station, crying.